Welcome to episode 0 of the History Tomcat. This is meant to be a learning experience for both me and my viewers, or perhaps my viewer. I don't know how many of you there are, and I doubt it's very many. Now, I will try and share my knowledge of history, you will try and share your knowledge of how to make this a better show. If you're watching this, that means that improvements have already been made. In the first version of this first Zeros episode, it was barely audible and it had to be re-recorded. There's constantly a learning process going on here. Now, this episode is about memoirs and historic fiction and using them to learn. Specifically about the pitfalls, the traps of identifying these as a sort of historical truth. Obviously, people, both historians and non-historians, love reading memoirs. We love reading testimonies of people who have been there, experienced an event, and told us all about it. And so, when I say memoirs, I do not only mean explicit non-fiction books, such as Winston Churchill's Memoirs of the Second World War. There are often books which are either fictional, like All Quiet on the Western Front, or partly fictionalized, like Tolstoy's Sevastopol stories, which are short stories which he wrote after visiting Sevastopol during the Crimean War, which are partly fictionalized but are also war reporting. So all of these are often read by people to try and learn about past events which these writers witnessed. And we're always taught to approach critically, but many people, many school teachers, many students will parrot, approach critically, and there's often a misunderstanding of what critically means, or sometimes there's not an understanding at all. I'm going to walk you through 3 different ways in which memoirs can get reality wrong and why. The first way in which we need to approach a memoir critically, this is the base level. This is the base level which everybody is taught in school or in undergraduate college. Everybody vaguely remembers this, that a memoirist could be lying. Now, people will lie for several reasons. Sometimes people will lie simply because they've committed a crime or they've been incompetent. For example, in the memoirs of the German generals after World War II, most of them did not admit that they participated in Hitler's war crimes. Most of them tried to blame all the war crimes on the SS and the Gestapo and the Nazis, and to say that they were just soldiers commanding their tank divisions and infantry divisions, and they were focusing on fighting the Russians or the Americans. But they did not do any of this awful stuff. No, sir. We know that many of these people were lying or heavily downplaying their participation in these crimes. Many of them were also blaming all of their military errors on Hitler, who, of course, was a lunatic, but this allowed them to say, well, all of the bad stuff, all the military defeats, that's Hitler, but we were well-trained generals, sons of a proud military tradition. We did nothing wrong. Another issue is bigotry or ideology. You will often see that people who have a strong political belief, whether they might be hardcore communists, will twist events for ideological reasons. The Soviet communist propaganda does this. Or for bigotry reasons, of course, somebody who is strong, for example, people who lived in the early 19th century had people who were involved in slave ownerships had difficulty recognizing that the people they owned in slaves, Africans, were as intelligent as they were. Even though some of them were quite stupid, the slave owners. Other slave owners were very, very smart. Thomas Jefferson was super smart, but he had a difficulty of adjusting to the reality that many of the people he owned as slaves were as intelligent as he was. Finally, the third reason why writers will lie. As an example, is a very more subtle one. Those of us who've read stories about service in the Navy, the British Navy in the Age of Sail, will always hear these stories about the rotten bread, the salty meat, which is like cardboard with salt on it, the worms in the bread. Now, some of this is sometimes true, but a lot of this is actually not. Because many sailors at the time, both people who were willingly sailors and people who were impressed and forced to serve in the British Navy, actually lied. They made their service sound a lot harder than it really was. And the reason they did this was, in the case of volunteers, to make themselves sound tougher. Or, you are resting there on land, we are pushing the rotten meat into our mouths, and then we are getting on the yardarm to, adjust the sails. Or if they were impressed, which was, and I must stress, it's really the fact that these people exaggerated how terrible their service was, does not mean it was not terrible. But it also does not mean that every single thing they said about the terribleness was true. And as an example, we have an elaborate record. There has been a very large, recent, very good book about this called Feeding Nelson's Navy. The True Story of Food at Sea in the Georgian Era by Janet Macdonald, which goes through all the records of how the food was made and how it was shipped and how it was stored on the ships, and all sorts of records from the era. And so we know that while, yes, food in the British Navy was Spartan, and yes, there were some incidents when it was really, truly terrible, but mostly the stories which we read exaggerate how terrible it was. And they exaggerated partly because some people were victims of the system and they wanted to highlight how terribly they were treated, and partly because some people felt that they were tough and strong and wanted to highlight how tough and strong they were. So people will not always lie because there's a crime or direct selfish interest. Sometimes they will just polish an event to make themselves sound better, or to make their victimization, even a true victimization, sound more terrible. Which brings us to number 2. A person's role in the events can limit their perception because a person's exposure to information about an event depends on what they were doing there. So, for example, if somebody is a soldier and somebody is fighting in the trenches, all they can their experience of the war is what they can see and hear, or what their comrades tell them. So, if they're frightened and their platoon is retreating and their lieutenant is killed, and their terrible trauma, and their best friend's blood is on their face, all of this, they might feel that the war was terrible and that they were losing. Perhaps they might. They might form. Sometimes a unit might get rooted and run in a fight because they feel that the battle is lost because it's lost where they are. And on the other hand, a general might have an insight from the professional standpoint of what is happening in the war, and where he needs to position the machine guns and the artillery, and when the air support is going to arrive. But he might not necessarily have first of all, he might have, as we said, polish some of his experience for political reasons, as generals often do, and he might also not fully understand the experience of the common soldier. The other issue with a person's position is not so much selfish per se, and so I'm not including this in selfishness. Because people will often think, oh, this memoirist is not a selfish person, he is known to be genuine, so he's not lying on purpose. Probably not. But there's another problem. And Ludwig von Mises, in his book, Bureaucracy, talks about it. He talks about it as an example of hospital management. He says, a hospital manager who is not corrupt, who is competent, who cares about patients and doctors, he wants to get for his hospital more funding so he can get better equipment, better MRI machines. Of course, these didn't exist in Mises' era, but better equipment, more surgeons, more beds. He will, of course, want a better budget. And people's experience of what they view professionally it what they experience in their daily life does shape their genuine perspective. And so take, for example, Stanton Stamenow. He was a prison psychologist. He worked with criminals. He wrote a book called Inside the Criminal Mind, based on his experience, his real lived experience. There's no deception in this book, but working with some of the worst criminals possible, and rapists and murderers and burglars and bank robbers. And he talks about how these people's human flaws led them to be criminals. And his whole view, he has a very dark view of human nature, in my opinion at least, which is informed by the fact he worked for years in the prison system with the worst people alive. And somebody who works in the space program might feel that people are brilliant and great because they've worked with some of the smartest people out there. And so if you read The Right Stuff, which is a book about fighter pilots, has a different view about human nature. Which, talking about human nature, leads us to 3. 3 is about the limits of cognition and knowledge itself. For many centuries, for many millennia, human memory was viewed as something which is a record. Some people use metaphors like writing for memory or drawing. In modern day, people compare memory to a videotape or a computer hard drive, but it's none of these things. When we approach memory from the standpoint of what the science says, and I am not a scientist, but I've read about this, memory changes constantly. A person's perception of what happened to him alters all the time. As a very grim example, when we talk, everyone is familiar with the satanic ritual abuse panic, which is a series of incidents in the late 1970s, in the 1980s, where children were claimed to have been ritually abused by their caretakers, by their school teachers, by their kindergarten staff. And although several people were convicted of these heinous crimes, we now know that none of these crimes ever transpired. And most of these people have now been not only acquitted, but exonerated and released from prison. And I have a book here called No Crueler Tyrannies: Accusation, False Witness, and Other Terrors of Our Times, by Dorothy Rabinowitz. And she talks about the fact that we have records of the original questioning of the children who were allegedly abused. And we know, because we have a record which was made at the time, that these children were very reluctant to say that they were abused. And it's clear that they were almost being pressured, in fact being pressured by their interrogators, to testify against their teachers and sometimes their families even. And we know today that they were not abused. This did not happen. Some of these people who allegedly did the abuse had alibis, and in later trials it was shown that they did not in fact do it. But we also have today, because many of these children are now adults, several of these people now have clear memories, which to them are absolutely genuine, of themselves being terrifyingly abused and in these dark rituals in the night by people whom they loved and trusted. And several of these people have serious mental problems as a result of this trauma, and their lives are genuinely miserable, but none of this occurred. And as a personal memory, as a personal experience, today is September 9th, anniversary of September 11th is in 2 days, And people often asked, what were you doing, when you heard the planes hit the buildings in New York City? Now, for years, I had a completely false memory of that day. I remembered being in school, in class, coming out of class at around noon, and being told the news of this attack on September 11th. Except that I don't live in the United States. I live in a completely different time zone, and so it is not. I live in the Middle East, and so it is not possible for an attack for an event which took place on September 11th in the morning in New York City for me to learn it on noon the same day. That's not how. That's impossible. And yet I remember this. And for many years I thought this as a completely accurate memory. What really happened is that clearly my mind somehow conflated as conversations which I had with my classmates about the event was some kind of stereotype which I had of where were you when it happened. And for many years I saw this as a genuine memory. Beyond the fact that memories themselves can be false, people also process the things which occur to them in a cultural context. And as an obvious example, people don't perceive risks rationally. Now, I want to preface this by saying that I'm not saying that people are stupid. Not all. A dichotomy between smart and rational is a false dichotomy. Between smart and irrational is a false dichotomy. What I'm saying is that people's heads are not calculators. People are more afraid, for example, of violence than they are afraid of heart attacks, even though I totally assure you that heart attacks kill a lot more people. Terrorism, people are afraid of their children being abducted, even though children so rarely get abducted by strangers that they are literally more likely to drown in a bathtub, yes? So, I, for example, worked for many years in a neighborhood which was considered a high-crime neighborhood in my country. But the actual crime levels were much lower than they are in, say, in downtown Detroit or I don't know, in Johannesburg, yes? Yet people who heard where I was working said, "How are you not afraid to work there?" I was not. Sometimes when I was walking from home or walking to work at night, at near midnight, and I saw some of the dubious characters which were about in the neighborhood, I felt some nervousness, but I knew that I was not really going to get maimed and dismembered and looted from my wallet. In fact, I was not. I am clearly giving this interview, yes, making this show. So, a person's perception of what is happening to them or what is happening around them is formed also by their cultural context of an event. If we talk about crime, many people, even now, believe that crime in the United States is rising, even though it has been falling for many years, and only recently had an uptick. But whenever you interview people, people who were interviewed in the late 90s when crime was constantly falling, people said, "No, crime is rising, crime is rising." Because in their context on television, there was constant discussion of crime. And later people were really concerned about terrorism because there was a constant discussion of terrorism. So I'm not saying that these people were stupid. That's not an issue of stupidity or wisdom. It's an issue of the fact that people make their decisions in a context. And a person's cultural context will also affect how they perceive events around them, how they perceive things in the news. And so, when we are reading something, we need to always be aware of what is the context of it being written. So this brings us back to where we started, to how and why to read memoirs for knowledge. It's important to always consider all of these flaws which we talked about, and also consider the context in which something was written and something was published. You want to think, who is this person? Who they are affecting what they are writing? You want to think, why are they writing this to start with? You want to think, why is it being published? Because if it's self-published, why is it self-published? But if it is not self-published, or if it is famous, why did it become famous at the time? This is important. We talked about sailors talking about their service in the Navy. Now there is a whole story, which I will not go into here, as to why sailor narratives were so popular in the early 19th century. Why if we are talking about memoirs of German generals after the war, why were they translated into English? This is a whole story which you probably you will want to be aware about if you want to go into detail about that. If you are reading the memoirs of police officers or persons from the criminal justice system in the 1980s, you will probably want to know that there was a high level of crime at the time, and people were very concerned about crime. If you want to read Joe Cirillo's Tales from the Stakeout Squad, he was a police officer in New York City, and you want to keep in mind that New York City at the time was a completely different place from now. So you need to be aware of the human flaws of writers, and you need to be aware of the context in which they wrote, and the context in which something here was published. Context, context, context.